So this is the fairy tale, the idea African soul, African. So here you see, this is what, they're imagining. Here's somebody, I'm an African, and then here's someone else, I'm an African too. And this person is just being sold, one African by another African. Here's one guy, he's an African, and he's, got the baby here. So, the white guy just passing by, window shopping. Oh, you know what? I have an African for you. And he picks it up. But what that does is it pits those on the continent against those in the diaspora, and the ones who laugh all the way to the bank are the ones who are manipulating one fragment against another fragment, just as they did in the first place that got us into this position. So let's go straight into it. So the rationale for the presentation was, we had comments on a talk that I gave, actually a panel that I helped DW organize called a street debate. And I checked this morning, it's something around like 306,000 views. But a lot of the comments, when I checked them, they were saying, Africans sold other Africans. They were sold, not stolen. So I'll show you a little bit about what that is. So again, the phrase Africans sold Africans is an anachronistic fairy tale, and I'll go into what anachronism means. No one self-identified as African during the transatlantic Mangamizi from 1441 through 1888, and really through the present, that you had political, ethnic, linguistic identities that were paramount and still are, and quote unquote whites are able to profit from diaspora against continental conflict. In YouTube comments today, that's DW, Deutschwell out of Germany, just as their forebears were able to profit from tribe against tribe, leading to prisoners of war during the anti-Black chattelization war. So the transatlantic Mangamizi disaster began with direct white raids and kidnapping. Anton Gonzalez in 1441 marks a precedent. Whites came ashore specifically to capture Black people and not to trade. So we'll go into that. Also, non-Black so-called white and Arab involvement was systemic and total, not passive. They financed, built ships, established transport routes, armed raiders, ran dungeons, sold, bought, insured, justified, and profited from every level of enslavement. If you can't come to Africa because of selling, how can you stay in the place of selling, buying, initiating, insuring, justifying, pseudoscientifically, legally, religiously, nakavalika? In propaganda, like Africans sold Africans, absolves, quote unquote, whites and Arabs to shield descendants of enslavers and kidnaps from divine righteous retribution, while misdirecting Black people's anger at each other. And then finally, I'm going to touch on not post-traumatic, but persistent traumatic. I'll explain what that is. So just to define my terms, a lot of people, when they think of the word slave, they think of Black people, but it actually comes from the word Slav, referring to Otto, one of their rulers who enslaved the Slavs. So what I always say is you can be put into a situation analogous to the Slavs, but you can never be a Slav. So that's why we use the term enslaved rather than quote unquote slaves. So we'll go straight. Now, I've used the term anachronism, and I don't know how many people are familiar with that term, but it's defined as a person or thing or idea that exists out of its time in history, especially one that happened or existed later than the period being shown, discussed, so forth and so on. Anachronism is chronological misplacing of persons, events, objects, or customs in regard to each other. And then, you go into the etymology, Greek, anachronismos, and so forth. So let's look at what that is. So let's give actual examples of what an anachronism would be. Let's look. So here you have this little kid, he's 7, 8 years old, and he was just told, oh, slavery started in 1619, and that's when the first African Americans came to shore. Well, he's thinking, well, I know a lot about African Americans. African Americans play basketball. So were they playing basketball in 1619? Because I know what African Americans do. So this is what he's imagining. I know African Americans take selfies and post them to Black Twitter. Is that what happened in 1619? Because I know everything that an African American does, right? I know just last week we had a cookout and there was a step show, right? And earlier my father went to the barber shop and my mother went to the beauty salon. So is that what was happening? Because I know all about African Americans. Oh, and my favorite rapper, what did they have rapping? Did he spit rhymes about what it was like, landing on shore? But if this was a 7 or 8 year old, you will forgive him because you know that this child doesn't know what an anachronism is. He thinks that in 1619 that there was anyone who came on shore called an African American who was doing what African Americans do. However, those of us who are full-grown adults, we know that nobody who came on shore in 1619 or before then, and that's another point to be made, self-identified as African American, much less could we expect them to behave based on a term that did not even exist at that time period. So we'll continue. And by the way, for those who are interested, the first time that the term African American was ever used was around the time of the so-called Revolutionary War, where you had someone who wrote an article for a newspaper where he decided to use a term to show that he was loyal to America and wasn't going to side with the brutish like others had done. So he decided to concoct a term called African American. But as many know, that term really did not gain currency until around 1988, when Jesse Jackson decided to adopt that term. But we'll continue. Now, again, when we're looking at what does anachronism mean, when people say Africans sold Africans, this is what, our 7 or 8 year old is imagining. Here you had some hapless, quote unquote, white people on the shore, sitting underneath some pool umbrellas, and someone approached them and said, "Oh, hey, hold on, who are you?" "I am an African." "Oh, well, who are these people with you?" "These are also Africans, and I have them for sale." "Well, we were just here, playing volleyball. I didn't know anything about this sale thing you're talking about. What's going on? But fortunately, we have some ships. Can I take them off your hands?" "Yes, you can take them off my hands because I have a cash register here and I have Africans for sale. I'm an African. Here are some more Africans. And it's just fortunate that you hapless whites who came here, you didn't know what was going to happen, but you lucked up, right? Here are some Africans for you." So this is what a 7-year-old or 8-year-old may imagine. Here's an African, and who is he selling? He's selling Africans, right? But this is anachronistic because there was nobody in 1441 who self-identified as an African, nor did he identify anyone around him as an African. But we'll go into all of that and why our 7 or 8-year-old is perhaps mistaken about the passive whites who just happened to be on the shore when some Black person, some African came up and said, "I have something for sale," an African. And just to that point, even the term Africa, African, all of those, these are exonyms, meaning that these are terms that the Romans used to identify their conquered province called Provincia Africa Proconsularis around 146. But it wasn't even used very often until more recent times. The terms that were used for the continent were, things like Ethiopia, Libya was also used for the entire continent. So this was just a thin strip of land. So obviously no one anywhere else would have self-identified when they had never even encountered the Romans, much less were they were familiar with the Roman term. So again, that is an anachronism. So this is a map from 1554, Munster, Sebastian. And again, you see in 1554, this thin little strip of land here is the only part that they referred to as Africa. And beyond that, the population of self-identifying Africans was 0. There was not a single person on the entire continent who self-identified as, "Look, me, I am an African." And you find the same thing here. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but right here where my cursor is what's labeled as Africa. Again, this is because even the term came from the Romans conquering Carthage around what's now modern-day Tunisia. So they only applied the term to that tiny parcel of land. So this is a world map from the Portolan Atlas, again showing only a small portion of what is now known as North Africa. Conceptually, linguistically, realistically, there's no such thing as African during this period, and no one self-identified as such, nor did they recognize their neighbors as such. And the cartographer Battista Agnese of Venice, Italy. But some of you would be surprised that even these quote-unquote super tribes that they now refer to them as, that even the term Yoruba is anachronistic, that it wasn't until 1829 in the work of Clapperton, where he writes, "We learned in fact that we were not now in the King of Badagry's territory, but in the district of Oyo, which is called Yoruba by the Arabs and the people of Hausa. This use was reinforced by Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther on a mission to Nigeria in 1841 when he decided to take up the exonym. Again, exonym means that this is what people outside of you call you, and he decided to just take it up to refer to mutually intelligible dialects. Thus began the adoption and entrenchment of Yoruba with his later publication on Yoruba grammar. So I wrote this as a chapter for a chapter, and the editor was like, he was blown away. He thought that the word Yoruba, he actually wrote an intro to my chapter. He said, oh, you know, we're not Black, that what we really are is we're Yoruba and Akan and so forth. And I said, I guess you don't know that Yoruba isn't even a Yoruba word. It's a meaningless word in what we now refer to as Yoruba, because it's an exonym and no one was calling themselves that before the 1800s.